No! Friendly! Friendly!
Who are you? Who sent you?
Nobody. There was an accident down on the road and... What's going on?
Oh, no. They're coming.
Who is? What the hell was that?
You have a gun?
What?
Please tell me you have a gun.
No, why would I?
Take it! Take it! Tell me it's out there.
Hey, are you listening?
Hey!
What the... Shit!
Welcome to Heroes Keep Gaming. This is our review of Resident Evil Village. As a disclaimer, this review was conducted on a base PS4 console, playing on the normal difficulty of the game. This review will contain spoilers. While I won't be recapping every story beat, in order to make a comprehensive review, I've decided not to leave out any essential details. As a follow-up to the 7th numbered entry in the Resident Evil series, and spiritual successor to the 4th numbered entry, Resident Evil Village has many roles to fill and high expectations to meet. The question is, does it live up to the previous entries it builds upon enough to stand on its own? The intention of this review is to analyze how Resident Evil Village fits into the overall series, take a look at what it does well, and what, if anything, it could have done better. To begin, we'll take a look at the visual presentation. Just like Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil Village looks incredible. I'm not sure what kind of magic went into creating the RE engine it runs on, but it often looks nearly photorealistic, especially in the first-person perspective of these games. I wouldn't feel foolish saying these are some of the best-looking games I've ever played. Now that we're in the 9th console generation, I was concerned it wouldn't be optimized for PlayStation 4 since I have yet to upgrade. But as soon as I played the demo on my base PS4, those fears were put to rest. Due to its setting, Village does tend to show more expansive vistas than 7 ever did, which can show the last-gen hardware being pushed to its limits, as faraway textures pop in when zoomed in on with a sniper rifle, or sometimes just look perpetually blurry. I also experienced some slight frame drops in the second half of the game, but overall it looks and performs immaculately on the PlayStation 4. The sound design is also some of the best I've ever heard. Every little ambient noise sounds hauntingly real and placed so specifically in the environment that you'll find yourself turning to look for the source of every creak of wood or rustle of branches. However, this is an unusual instance where I feel the sound design might be too good. I know that sounds like a ridiculous thing to say, but the issue is that so many of the creepy sounds are just that. Creepy sounds that play just to be creepy. There is no source attached to them, no creature that pops out. They're just sounds that constantly trigger as you explore the environment. For a while, they do an amazing job of keeping you on edge, expecting something to jump out at any moment. But after the 20th time you've heard the convincing creaking of someone walking in the other room of a half-destroyed house you've explored, only for no one to be there, it becomes more of a minor annoyance than an effective atmospheric flourish, evoking the subtle eye roll of a neighbor playing crappy music too loud, rather than its intended pulse-pounding terror. The music takes a backseat here more than in most Resident Evil games, where you can recall certain iconic tracks. However, there are a few moments where it picks up to build anticipation, and in those instances it works really well. The save room music appears more as a barely audible Easter egg the first time you encounter Village's merchant, the Duke, and isn't heard from again. It's an intelligent decision for an effective horror game, but removes a bit of the charm. Moving on, let's take a look at the gameplay of Resident Evil Village. Just like Resident Evil 7, the main antagonists in Village are an extremely disturbed family, each with different horrifying abilities and their own distinct section of the map to explore before eliminating them. Lady Dimitrescu needs no introduction thanks to the meme status she garnered following the game's reveal. Jokes and hype aside, she's the most compelling villain in the game, which makes it all the more unfortunate that she's barely in it. Once you've completed her castle, you realize that she was filling the same role Jack Baker played in Resident Evil 7, the first and most fully realized antagonist, who is seemingly unkillable and hunts you down incessantly until being dispatched once you've cleared the first area. This is one of many design decisions that seems was made to follow the exact bullet points of what Resident Evil 7 did, instead of adapting its elements to be utilized in the most effective way possible. As a tall, gray-skinned being with claws on her right hand, Dimitrescu drew comparisons to the Resident Evil series' original big bad, Tyrant, leading up to the game's release. It seems it would have been a great addition to have her hunt you throughout the game, at least in several different sections, similar to Mr. X in RE2. Following the structure of Resident Evil 7 so closely certainly works, but it's hard not to feel that much of what Village offers plays like somewhat of an arbitrary retread. The best sequels tend to follow the same bullet points as the original, but do so in a way that is so new and different it isn't immediately apparent to the viewer. Village makes no effort to hide it. By sticking so close to Resident Evil 7's overall game design and narrative structure, while drawing its visual inspiration from Resident Evil 4, Village is asking for comparisons to be made. It's when making these comparisons you begin to see its potential that was hindered by playing it safe and not straying too far from what was expected. Aside from the boss enemies, the primary enemies you'll face in Resident Evil Village are werewolves, which have overrun the unnamed European village you find yourself in. This was an intriguing first for the Resident Evil series. As such a classic horror icon, werewolves have been reimagined countless times, but they have rarely been as terrifying as their depiction in Resident Evil Village. The werewolves make perfect sense as a substitute for the parasite-infected villagers of Resident Evil 4 and exude a much more imposing presence. Unfortunately, despite their dynamic movement and impactful attacks, seeing only 3 to 5 of them show up at a time for nearly the game's full duration renders once fierce battles routine and dull. For a game with such strong combat mechanics, it's a shame that enemy encounters are so infrequent. Resident Evil 4 pitted the player against an overwhelming number of enemies from the start, and continually raised the stakes by throwing greater numbers of enemies and new enemy types at the player throughout its duration. Every new area acted as a memorable combat arena, and the excitement never let up. On Resident Evil Village's standard difficulty, you'll find yourself bombarded with enemies at the very start of the game, only to find it was a scripted sequence. After that, you won't encounter more than 4 or 5 enemies at a time, until around 3/4 of the way through the game. Playtime will vary, but based on my first attempt at a completionist run, this was about the 8-hour mark. Up until that point, combat encounters are scattered so infrequently that you can never really get into a rhythm with them. What's worse is the second boss encounter resides in an area where no weapons are allowed at all. This section of the game serves as a well-crafted PT-inspired puzzle sequence, but the pacing of the game screeches to a halt in the process. I do have to give this part of the game credit for resurrecting one of the most unusual concepts that was abandoned from the Resident Evil 4 beta, also known as Resident Evil 3.5, which showed Leon fighting possessed dolls. The concept was originally scrapped because the developers felt its supernatural elements didn't fit into the more grounded Resident Evil universe, where all enemies are the result of biological experiments. It's awesome that they were able to make that concept work in the context of Resident Evil, and admirable that they were able to make possessed dolls creepy, as that tends to be a horror trope I always find more silly than effective. Still, the idea of replaying Village is significantly less appealing knowing I'll have to repeat this section, because this kind of horror becomes dull once you're aware of its puzzle solutions and scariest moments. For that reason, this section of the game feels like it would have been more appropriate as a DLC chapter, to be enjoyed separately for a single playthrough. The remaining 2 boss chapters return to Village's standard formula and offer up a decent amount of combat, but are still hampered by the limited enemy count that makes each encounter repetitive and unsurprising, save for those couple brief sequences 8 hours in, mentioned previously, where you're absolutely swarmed with enemies in a battle that seems will never end and are pushed to your limits. If only there were more moments like that. The game's semi-closing sequence places you in the role of Chris Redfield, and does pit you in an all-out assault with seemingly unlimited ammo and enemies pouring out at you from all angles. It's a frenetic blast and mirrors those climactic moments from previous entries where action is dialed up to 11 for one final sequence that seems to channel the best James Cameron films.
Alright! Reloading now. Just a minute. There's a swarm headed that way.
Next, let's see how the story stacks up to the other entries in the series. In Resident Evil Village, protagonist Ethan Winters makes a return from Resident Evil 7. Ethan was the perfect hero for that entry, as the developers realized the familiar characters in the series had eliminated so many BOWs that inhabiting their role no longer posed any threat to the player. Ethan functioned as a blank slate for players to imprint themselves upon and helped make 7 the scariest entry in the series yet. However, this also makes Ethan's return difficult to get excited about. Aside from his remarkable ability to reattach his own severed limbs with a few staples and heal quickly with a bit of herbs and chem fluid, he's effectively your standard everyman, whose face is never even revealed to the player. Having fan favorite Chris Redfield appear to be a villain to Ethan, after seemingly killing his wife and kidnapping his child in Village's intro, was a great story choice that made the game immediately intriguing and introduced a mystery that demanded to be solved. Village's story is one of its stronger aspects, and while it doesn't compare to the highs of the original tank control games or even Resident Evil 7, it explains Ethan's aforementioned eccentricities from Resident Evil 7, and in doing so, Chris's behavior toward him and his family. It also introduces the most disturbing story element of any Resident Evil title, as Ethan discovers his infant daughter Rose has been dismembered into 4 different pieces, which he is then tasked with recovering under the guidance that he'll be able to restore her once doing so.
She can be saved, you know.
Saved? From this? Are you insane?
There's a house with a red chimney on the western side of the village. Go and seek out the man who lives there. Then we can continue our conversation.
It's a surprisingly extreme horror concept that the game's presentation reels in to be less unsettling with its overarching theme of the story running parallel to that of a children's fairy tale. This is an understandable choice to downplay such a troubling plot device, but does end up feeling tonally inconsistent with the rest of the series. Overall, the revelation that Ethan has unwittingly become the same kind of bioweapon he fought in Resident Evil 7 makes Chris's hostility toward him understandable, and intelligently brings the story full circle and fills in every lingering question players have had since 2017. While not as remarkable as the tales that have made the Resident Evil series one of the most interesting game narratives to dig into for decades, it's difficult to think of a more fitting send-off for Ethan Winters' character. Speaking of send-offs, this YouTube channel is just getting started, so I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe so you can see more videos like this from me in the future, as well as some retrospectives on games that I've enjoyed a lot more than Resident Evil Village over the years. Ultimately, instead of embracing its own strongest elements and forging its own new path through the series, Resident Evil Village is an uneven compromise between 2 vastly different styles of game. Most of its memorable moments are delivered via the smoke and mirrors of scripted cinematic sequences and unnecessarily good sound design. Had it given players more agency to create standout moments of their own through consistent, well-crafted battles that took full advantage of its excellent combat mechanics, it could have been one of the highlights of the series. As it stands, Resident Evil Village is destined to live in the shadow of the much bolder entries it was inspired by. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep gaming.